Trump's protest response gives China a propaganda win. Hong Kong protesters running amok. Innocent citizens under siege. Outside actors engaging in terrorist acts. Police struggling to maintain control and in desperate need of reinforcements. That was how Chinese state media portrayed anti-government protests in Hong Kong last year, dismissing calls for greater democracy and an investigation into police brutality by focusing on individual acts of violence and property damage. The widespread unrest, and the prospect of more this year, has been used to justify a new national security bill that will be imposed upon the city by Beijing in coming months. Washington has fiercely criticized that bill, moving to strip Hong Kong of its special trading status with the United States and threatening sanctions against officials involved in implementing the legislation. Throughout the protests in Hong Kong last year, the U.S. was consistent in its support of people's right to take to the streets and have their voice heard, and that sporadic violence or illegality did not undermine the core demands or legitimacy of the movement. Facing widespread unrest and public anger at home in the wake of the death of George Floyd, an unarmed black man, at the hands of a police officer in Minneapolis, the reaction from U.S. President Donald Trump appeared markedly different. In a barrage of tweets over the weekend, Trump called protesters thugs, accused organized groups of being behind the violence, blamed the media for fomenting unrest, called for the military to be deployed, and retweeted claims that those behind the unrest were domestic terrorists. It was a response that might not have appeared out of place on the pages of China's own government-controlled newspapers and did not go unnoticed by state media pundits and officials in Beijing, some of whom have publicly delighted in watching the unrest unfold in the U.S., sarcastically calling for solidarity with protesters and pointing out the alleged hypocrisy of their American counterparts. "I can't breathe" on Saturday, Hua Chunying, a spokeswoman for China's foreign ministry, tweeted "I can't breathe" among the final words uttered by Floyd before he died, along with a statement by the U.S. State Department on Hong Kong. Hua, one of a new breed of increasingly vociferous Chinese diplomats, also shared an article by RT, the Russian state-run broadcaster, accusing the U.S. of hypocrisy for its reaction to the respective protests. Her colleague, Zhao Lijian, who has previously accused Washington of supporting Hong Kong independence forces and violent radicals, also shared tweets along the same lines, including one from Hu Zijin, editor of the nationalist Chinese tabloid The Global Times, crowing that the beautiful sight defined by U.S. politicians has eventually extended from Hong Kong to the U.S. Now they can witness it by their home windows, Hu wrote. "I want to ask Speaker Pelosi and Secretary Pompeo, should Beijing support protests in the U.S., like you glorified rioters in Hong Kong?" Washington is no stranger to accusations of hypocrisy, particularly regarding U.S. support of democratic movements abroad, while failing to tackle civil rights issues at home. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was often quick to point out the many societal issues plaguing the U.S., not least complaints about widespread racial discrimination and police abuse that are still ongoing today. Speaking to CNN ahead of the most recent protests, Patrick Mahoney, a U.S.-based activist and founder of the Christian Defense Coalition, said that having traveled all around the world, that is always a critique I hear from people, that the U.S. government is willing to address human rights in other countries while we have issues in our own. "Generally speaking, I want to believe that our government is as committed to human rights and freedoms and speaking against police brutality in the U.S. as they are in Hong Kong," said Mahoney, who has been involved in both protests in Hong Kong and those over Floyd's death in the U.S. "But I don't think that, if we're not committed to the same principles in America, that we shouldn't be speaking out." Awkward alliance. While support for Hong Kong is bipartisan in Washington, some of the most prominent backers of last year's protests were Republican politicians, particularly Senators Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, as well as administration officials like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Their support has been gladly accepted in Hong Kong, where some protesters last year took to flying the U.S. flag and calling for Trump himself to intervene as they lobbied for the passage of a bill in support of the city's political freedoms. Among conservatives, one joke is, what's the difference between Hong Kong protesters and Democrats? Hong Kong protesters love America, Mahoney said. But he was critical of those who saw the movement in such simplistic terms, saying that the values they were fighting for were universal, not inspired by Washington. "All we have to do is look to the Middle East to see what American values have done to the region there," he said. Hong Kongers may share in some ideals with the U.S., he added, but they weren't waving the flag to be pro-America, rather because they wanted America to stand with them in this struggle. Speaking to CNN last month, Promise Lee, an activist and member of the Hong Kong-based Lawson Collective, said that most protesters look at the US and Trump as purely a tactical thing. They personally would never subscribe to right-wing ideals, but what choice do they have? It's not about strong ideological allegiance to the right wing, it's about what works in the moment, he added. This has created an awkward situation for many Hong Kong protesters, who may feel a sense of solidarity with those taking to the streets in the US, but are torn over potentially alienating their allies in Washington, almost all of whom are taking a hard line on the protests. Cruz, who last year traveled to Hong Kong to voice his support for the opposition movement, has reiterated calls to designate Antifa, a loose term which can cover various left-wing protesters and anti-government activists, a hate group. Rubio has also denounced Antifa terrorists as being behind unrest in American cities, using language reminiscent of Chinese state media coverage of Hong Kong. Rare agreement? Critics have long accused President Trump of having authoritarian leanings, and more than a decade before running for office, he appeared to praise Beijing's crackdown on protests in Tiananmen Square in 1989. When the dust clears after this weekend, Beijing may be hoping for more than just a chagrined Washington, but maybe even a degree of sympathy for its hardline position on Hong Kong. Indeed, Hu Zijin, the Global Times editor, has used the American unrest as a way to encourage solidarity, not among protesters in Hong Kong and the US, but between the respective governments dealing with widespread demonstrations. In an English-language video Sunday, Hu noted that some in China have cheered the protests because the US government and US Congress supported the riots in Hong Kong. However, the Chinese government has not shown any support for the riots in the US. I hope that Americans notice Beijing's restraint. We have not tried to kick the US while it is down, he said. There are of course different reasons for the riots, but their similarities are overwhelming. They all defy the law, subvert order, and are destructive. Burning police stations, blocking roads, smashing shops, and destroying public facilities in Minneapolis and other places are exactly the same violence in the Hong Kong demonstrations. The ability of Washington to influence Beijing's position on Hong Kong, which is in part founded on fear of outside influence in the city, was already severely limited. The Trump administration's reaction to protests at home may have hurt its position even further. Protesters take a knee and raise their hands in the middle of Canal Street in a standoff with police at a rally on May 31 in New York. Firefighters extinguish a blaze that destroyed a KMBC vehicle in Kansas City, Missouri, on May 31. A young boy raises his fist for a photo by a family friend during a demonstration on May 31 in Atlanta. Protesters face off with police in downtown Santa Monica, California, on May 31. Demonstrators prayed during a march on May 31 in Atlanta. A police officer aims a non-lethal weapon as protesters raise their hands during demonstrations on May 31 in Santa Monica, California. A man screams as he sees a policeman take a knee next to the White House on May 31 in Washington. Members of the California Army National Guard stand guard outside of City Hall on May 31 in Los Angeles. Demonstrators gather to protest near the White House in Washington, D.C. on Sunday, May 31. Protesters march during a rally in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on May 31. A New York City police officer takes a knee during a demonstration by protesters in Times Square at a rally on May 31 in New York. Demonstrators at a protest outside the Minnesota Capitol ringed with state troopers and National Guard soldiers in St. Paul on May 31. Protesters march in Washington, D.C. on May 31. Armored vehicles and soldiers from the Minnesota Army National Guard surround the state capitol in St. Paul, Minnesota, on May 31. Shayna Ford stands in front of police in Washington on Saturday, May 30. A protester runs past burning cars and buildings on Chicago Avenue on May 30 in St. Paul, Minnesota. Protesters link arms in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina, on May 30. A firework explodes by a police line on May 30 near the White House in Washington. Looters ransack an Urban Outfitters store on May 30 in Seattle. A Los Angeles Police Department kiosk burns in the Grove Shopping Center during a protest in Los Angeles on May 30. Police push people back as they detain a protester in Las Vegas on May 30. Protesters hold up metal gates as they build a barrier in a roadway on May 30th in Las Vegas. A vehicle burns near New York's Union Square on May 30th in New York City. A protester in an Elmo mask dances as a fire burns in Philadelphia on May 30th. Police in riot gear watch as demonstrators gather to protest the death of George Floyd on May 30th near the White House. Bridges over the Chicago River are lifted to limit transportation to and from the Loop, where protesters clashed with police in Chicago on May 30th. Part of the historic Metro Courthouse in Nashville, Tennessee, was set on fire during demonstrations that turned violent on May 30th. Police advanced through smoke and tear gas toward demonstrators in Minneapolis on Saturday. An unidentified protester confronts a Tampa police officer at police headquarters in downtown Tampa, Florida, on May 30th. Protesters begin to kneel during a protest in Queens on May 30th in New York City. A demonstrator is injured during a protest on May 30th near the White House in Washington. Protesters jump on an overturned car near the Municipal Services Building in Philadelphia on Saturday. A policeman shoots rubber bullets at protesters throwing rocks and water bottles during a demonstration near the Miami Police Department on Saturday in downtown Miami, Florida. Police stand guard near CNN Center and Centennial Olympic Park as protests continue on Saturday in Atlanta. A protester receives first aid after being sprayed with pepper spray by police outside the State House in Columbus, Ohio, on Saturday. Demonstrators clash as people gather to protest the death of George Floyd on Saturday, May 30th, near the White House in Washington. People with signs and masks that read "I can't breathe" attend a protest in Chicago on Saturday. Police hold back demonstrators in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles on Saturday, May 30th. A protester holds a sign while a vehicle burns in the street in Philadelphia on Saturday. People stand on top of a baseball backstop during a protest in Los Angeles on Saturday, May 30th. Thousands of people stage a die-in at the Colorado State Capitol on Saturday in Denver. Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson high-fives a woman who called his name as he marches with protesters in Flint, Michigan, on May 30th. Protesters rally outside the State House on Saturday in Columbus, Ohio. Protesters march near the Salt Lake City Police Department on Saturday in Salt Lake City. Protesters chant outside Dallas City Hall on Saturday, May 30th. A check-cashing business burns during protests in Minneapolis on Friday, May 29th. A protester holds his hands up as police officers keep demonstrators away from the White House in Washington early Saturday, May 30th. People vandalize a Walgreens store Friday during protests in Oakland, California. Police officers move forward to clear the street during a protest in downtown Los Angeles on Friday. Police officers fire tear gas at protesters near the Colorado State Capitol in Denver on Friday. Police officers and protesters clash near the CNN Center in Atlanta on Friday. A man walks away as a car catches fire in a parking garage in Minneapolis on Friday. Protesters block a street with signs in Los Angeles on Friday. Police in riot gear form a line near the Centennial Olympic Park and CNN Center in Atlanta, where some confronted police, who sprayed some demonstrators with pepper spray on Friday. A group of men raised their fists after making their way onto Interstate 75 and stopping traffic in Cincinnati, Ohio, on Friday. People attempt to extinguish cars on fire on Friday in Minneapolis. A protester is detained by police in Houston on Friday. Protesters confront police officers while blocking the 110 freeway in Los Angeles. Protesters calling for an end to police violence walk through downtown Lexington, Kentucky, on Friday. Demonstrators climb atop a truck while blocking all lanes of traffic on Interstate 880 in Oakland, California, on Friday. Protesters burn a flag outside the CNN Center in Atlanta on Friday. A protester is doused with milk on Friday in Minneapolis. A man stands on top of a burning police car during a protest on Friday, outside of CNN Center in Atlanta. Demonstrators walk along Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington during a protest Friday. A police officer holds down a protester, while another officer pepper sprays a crowd outside a police station in Boston on Friday. Protesters chant in Civic Center Park during a protest on Friday in Denver. Chanting Black Lives Matter, I Can't Breathe, protesters gathered at the J.C. Nichols Fountain on Country Club Plaza in Kansas City, Missouri. Demonstrators protest outside CNN headquarters in Atlanta on Friday. Protesters ride in cars in a demonstration in Louisville, Kentucky, over the deaths of Floyd and Breonna Taylor, an EMT who was killed in a police shooting earlier this year in Louisville. Protesters gather in front of a Manhattan courthouse and jail on Friday. A protester holds up an American flag in New Orleans on Friday. Jamela J. Pettiford sings during a protest outside the Hennepin County Government Center in Minneapolis on Friday. CNN journalist Omar Jimenez, who identifies as Black and Latino, is taken into police custody during a live broadcast early Friday at the site of the protests in Minneapolis. Jimenez's crew, including a producer and a camera operator, were also placed in handcuffs. They have since been released from custody. Law enforcement officers gathered along Lake Street early on Friday as fires burned after a night of unrest in Minneapolis. Protesters gather in front of a burning fast food restaurant early Friday in Minneapolis. Protesters link arms and surround a police officer to protect him from the crowd in Louisville on Thursday. A protester winces in pain after being sprayed with pepper spray by police during a demonstration near the Memphis Police Department precinct in Memphis, Tennessee, on Thursday, May 28. A protester dumps heating fuel on the fire at the Minneapolis Police 3rd Precinct on Thursday. Protesters demonstrate outside of a burning Minneapolis Police 3rd Precinct on Thursday. A protester moves around the smoke-filled 3rd Precinct building of the Minneapolis Police Department on Thursday. A woman yells at a sheriff's deputy during a protest Thursday in Minneapolis. Fire crews work to put out fires after an apartment building under construction was burned to the ground during protests Thursday in Minneapolis. A protester is detained by police during a rally in Union Square in New York City on Thursday. Tony L. Clark holds up a poster of Floyd on Thursday near Cup Foods in Minneapolis. Protesters speak to cops during a Black Lives Matter demonstration in New York City on Thursday. A protester reacts in the midst of a cloud of tear gas Thursday in St. Paul, Minnesota. Hundreds of people listened to speakers Thursday outside of Cup Foods, a neighborhood grocery store, where police first encountered Floyd in South Minneapolis. People continue to protest in Minneapolis on Thursday. Tony L. Clark, left, consoles Gwen Dumas near a convenience store on Thursday. People look on as a construction site burns in a fire near the 3rd Precinct in Minneapolis on Wednesday. A group of demonstrators gather in Midtown Memphis, Tennessee, on Wednesday. A firework explodes as a fire burns Wednesday inside an AutoZone store near the 3rd Precinct in Minneapolis. Neighbors fight with garden hoses and buckets to save homes after rioters set fire to a multi-story affordable housing complex under construction near the 3rd Precinct on Wednesday, May 27, in Minneapolis. Protesters raise their hands up as they react to tear gas during a demonstration in Minneapolis on Wednesday. People join hands across a freeway in Los Angeles during a Black Lives Matter protest on Wednesday. Protesters use shopping carts as a barricade as they confront police near the Minneapolis Police 3rd Precinct on Wednesday. Demonstrators in Minneapolis raise their hands Wednesday as they stand off with police. Two police officers stand on the roof of the 3rd Precinct holding a projectile launcher during Wednesday's demonstration in Minneapolis. A protester holds up his hands Wednesday in Minneapolis. Minneapolis protesters react Wednesday as a projectile launched by police explodes near. Minneapolis police stand by an illustration of Floyd as demonstrators rally on Wednesday. Protesters gather in Los Angeles on Wednesday. Kika Villarreal, left, and her daughter Aubrey march with fellow Black Lives Matter protesters on Wednesday in Los Angeles. A man faces a row of police holding a burnt U.S. flag as protesters gather Wednesday in downtown Los Angeles. Protesters gather Tuesday, May 26, near the Minneapolis Police 3rd Precinct. Demonstrators march on Hiawatha Avenue in Minneapolis on Tuesday while shouting slogans decrying Floyd's death. Demonstrators react Tuesday outside Cup Foods in Minneapolis. A police officer throws a tear gas canister toward protesters during a rally in Minneapolis on Wednesday. 3 women join hands and pray around a makeshift memorial for Floyd in Minneapolis on Tuesday. Protesters and police face off during a rally Tuesday in Minneapolis. Crowds gather in the street at a protest Tuesday in Minneapolis. People gather outside a police precinct during the demonstrations Tuesday in Minneapolis. Tear gas is fired as protesters clash with police while demonstrating outside the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis. A protester is doused with milk after exposure to percussion grenades and tear gas near the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis. People gather and pray around a makeshift memorial in Minneapolis near the site where Floyd was taken into police custody the previous day. People stand outside the Minneapolis Police 3rd Precinct and chant, "Hands up, don't shoot." A demonstrator holds a sign reading "Justice for George" at Chicago Avenue and East 38th Street in South Minneapolis. Police dressed in tactical gear attempt to disperse crowds in Minneapolis. Protesters rally around a damaged police vehicle in Minneapolis. Milk is poured on the face of a protester who had been exposed to percussion grenades and tear gas Tuesday in Minneapolis. A car is hit with tear gas Tuesday near the 3rd Precinct in Minneapolis. Crowds rally and call for justice for Floyd in Minneapolis on Tuesday. Protesters gather in the rain Tuesday in Minneapolis near the spot where Floyd was arrested. Shawanda Hill, Center, the girlfriend of Floyd, reacts Tuesday in Minneapolis near the spot where he died. Click subscribe to receive the latest news.